Okay, in this unit we're going to be looking at the history of evolution. We're going to be focusing on Darwin, his travels, what he did, what he came up with as far as evolution goes, and what we hold to science as a result of that. So let's go ahead and get started with this. All right. Charles Darwin, he was born in England in 1809, and his family, his father especially, wanted him to go into medicine, focus on that for his career. And so when he got to the age when he was going to college, he focused on medicine. However, that was not something that he was interested in, even though it was something that his family wanted him to go in. So since that wasn't his area that he enjoyed, he tried the clergy. Okay, so he switched from medicine to the clergy around that same time. Once again, there wasn't a whole lot to choose from. If you were any type of standing in England during this time period, you chose medicine, you chose the clergy, you chose politics, something like that. And so he went the route of the clergy. Once he finished with his schooling at Cambridge, he got the opportunity to take a surveying job before he got into his work. He had the opportunity. There was going to be a ship to go out. It was going to pretty much be a surveying job, making maps of areas that hadn't been recently explored. And so he took this job on this ship called HMS Beagle. And this was it was around 1827, 1835 when he took this job, and the boat sailed, and he was gone for 5 years. Okay, so even though he was doing surveying, he was also working as a naturalist. And what a naturalist does is the naturalist takes or gathers observations of the world around him. Okay, so all these places that the Beagle went, or every place that they stopped, he would go on land. He would get off the boat. He would go on land. He was always seasick, so he didn't want to stay on the boat anyways. He wanted to get off as much as possible. So every time they stopped, he would get off and he would go explore the area that they were docked at, the port that they stayed at. And he would take, he would write in his journals. He would take information down about the local plant life, animal life. He would also do his surveying job, so he was creating the topography for the maps, recording the information he would need to build his maps of the areas as well. And like I said, this lasted about 5 years, and you can see the journey, okay, where they started. They started obviously out in England. They went south through the Atlantic. They made it to South America, okay, and then they stopped at a lot of different ports along the eastern coast of South America. And once they got down to the tip, and they came back around, then they stopped at some more ports. Right here at this island, just off the coast of South America, his gathering of this information as he went down the local plant and animal life. Once he got to the Galapagos, he did the same thing. And as he did this, he started realizing that there wasn't, he started realizing the differences, let's just say, for right now, of the different plants and animals, especially animals. He focused a lot on animals that you could see in these different places. Now, at the time, let's talk about a brief history about belief systems at the time, there in the 1800s. while he was on his trip, the majority of the human population, the industrialized human population, believed that the Earth in all of its forms had been created within just a few thousand years. Okay, so within 3,000 or 4,000 years, that's how old everything was. Whether it be the soil or the continents, the animals, the plants, so everything was recently new as far as the genealogy or as far as the lifespan goes. They also believed that within those few thousand years that life hadn't changed very much at all. Nothing had changed very much at all. So this idea of a fixity of species was what was the main concept that was believed back in the 1800s. This idea that nothing ever changes, nothing ever adapts, everything always stays the same. Darwin, however, through these different places that they stopped, and he was doing his surveying job, he was also taking notes in his journals about the different plant life. He was noticing through his observations that maybe this wasn't exactly true. Okay, Darwin actually used other people to help influence some of his ideas as well. So he had writings from other people, then he looked at what other scientists had done. One big scientist that helped influence some of his thinking was James Hutton. James Hutton was the person that really looked at and studied the geology of the planet, the movement of the Earth as far as the creation of mountains and valleys and the forces that cause these things to change. And Hutton was the first one to propose that the Earth had to be more than just a few thousand years old just by looking at the geology of the land. Okay, he also looked at other geologists like Lyell as far as some of the information Lyell wrote about in his book. And he also hinted at these forces that helped shape the land, and he focused mainly on volcanic activity, which later would tie into plate tectonics, but being these forces that had a big impact on causing the land to change. So Darwin took these theories as far as land changing, land masses changing due to volcanic activity, looking at how mountains change, looking at what you could find in these different areas, and he tied that into his own observations. And what he noticed everywhere he went, especially around South America, he noticed that everywhere he went, there was a really big difference in the makeup of these plants and animals that he saw. Which means that he thought, okay, so if land can change, if land masses can change due to movement of volcanic activity, then why can't the animals and plants change with them? His biggest source of information came from the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so as they were stopping along the different ports for different reasons, and he would get off and take his observations and do his recordings. Here in the Galapagos Islands, these groups of islands off the west coast of South America, was where he gathered most of his information. Now, what he noticed on these islands, okay, on this grouping of Galapagos Islands, were that there were animals that were very similar in the way they looked. However, if you looked at them closely, and he was able to go to each island and actually look at these different animals closely, even though they might seem similar, they had different physical traits that allowed them to survive specifically on the environments in those particular islands, because no island here in this grouping of the Galapagos had the same environmental factors. Okay, maybe there was different soil makeup or different plant life makeup or different terrain. Okay, and so these animals that looked very similar, the big types of animals he looked at were birds and reptiles. These animals that looked very similar from afar, when you got close, they did have different physical traits, small physical traits, but just different enough to allow them to survive in the different environments on these islands. He focused a lot on finches. He focused a lot on iguanas. Those are the two major animals that he looked at on the Galapagos. The finches, the birds, and the small little changes they had between the islands, and then the marine iguanas that he observed as well. When looking at the finches, he noticed that they all looked very similar to the finches that you can find on the continent of South America. Okay, and they also looked very similar to each other on the different islands of the Galapagos. But what he was thinking is, he said, okay, right? He traveled to and looked at different places in Africa. He looked at different places in South America. His big thinking was South America and Africa, two similar or two continents that have similar environments on them. Okay, South America and the Galapagos, two places that have similar environments. However, there were differences in these finches that he observed on South America, the mainland, on the Galapagos, and even on the finches that he observed in Africa. And he was wondering what was the purpose, what was the cause of these differences. And he guessed, using normal observation and common sense, that especially when you looked at the finches of the birds on the mainland of South America, comparing them to the birds on the Galapagos, that the birds on the Galapagos probably once started out as living on the mainland of South America, because that was the closest large continent that had the largest amount of forested area, which had the largest amount of food and habitat for the finches. And as these islands formed, these Galapagos Islands formed over the years, that the finches, some of the finches migrated here due to, maybe environmental factors, due to habitat loss, whatever the reason behind it. And that made the most common sense, that's where these finches that are found on the Galapagos Islands came from. They came from the mainland and they just migrated over. However, once they got to the Galapagos, the environment was different just enough. There were small little differences on, say, finding the right food source, being able to hide from the predators there, that they had to change due to the small little differences in the environment on the Galapagos versus the mainland. This also helped give evidence or support the evidence or support his ideas that this allowed for there to be such a large number of species of birds and how they were different on each of these particular islands that make up the Galapagos. Okay, for example, these are just a few of the types that you could find on the different islands. The woodpecker finch versus the ground versus the cactus finch. And they're the same family of bird, but they did have small differences. And those differences were based on the environment that they live in. So Darwin concluded from looking at all of this that each species descended from an original species, okay, from the mainland finches on South America. However, they just changed over time. And they changed due to their environment. They changed to survive. He calls this descent with modification, or the term that we think of, evolution. Okay, and evolution is just change in a species over time. That's the definition of evolution.